I'm Edward Carr, The Economist Deputy Editor.
Hello, my name's Callum Williams. I'm Senior Economics Writer at The Economist, and I am joining Ed to answer your questions on this call.
I'd like to think that's what would happen. I'm not sure it is what's going to happen. And partly because I think we're going to go through a very, very difficult time in the economy. And big economic disruptions tend to unsettle politics and to create grievances and resentments. The second thing is a context in which this pandemic struck, and it's one in which the post-Second World War order is breaking down, where China is clearly the rising power, where the United States, certainly under Donald Trump, has either a less willingness or capacity to be able to play the role of sort of overarching power who is prepared to get involved all over the world to try and sort out people's problems. And I think that sort of sense of a world that's slightly falling apart and a more rivalrous world where the United States is worried about Chinese power, the pandemic has come and hit the world at just when those issues are becoming more intense. And so I fear that it makes them harder to solve rather than easier to solve.
This era of globalization was very much slowing long before the COVID pandemic came along, and that was only partly related to the election of Donald Trump. It was slowing even before he became president, and I think that was a kind of lingering after effect of the financial crisis. But what the historical experience tends to show is that crises tend to kind of reinforce pre-existing trends, and deglobalization was one of them. Financial markets are hoping on this idea of a V-shaped recession, and that's the idea that in one quarter or perhaps in 2 quarters GDP will decline by perhaps an astonishing amount, but because lockdowns will come to an end, people will make up for lost time, and you'll see a quick rebound back to where we were at the beginning of 2020. I think what people are now starting to wonder is whether that really is going to happen. And in particular, they're looking at what's happening in China, which began to ease its lockdown in kind of late February and March. And at the moment, it's certainly the case that economic activity has recovered from its lows, but it's still a long way off. The Chinese economy is running at about 90% capacity compared with what it was at before the pandemic hit. And that's really for a few reasons. What you're seeing is that people are going back to the office and going back to the factory and all that kind of stuff, basically because they have to. But what they're not doing is going out and spending the money, having a good time, investing in big things. And what that means is that the sort of supply side of the Chinese economy has in a way got back to normal, but the demand side hasn't. And that means that unemployment is going to probably be persistently quite high in China for quite a long time. So people working in restaurants, in bars, in shops and all that kind of thing, there just isn't really demand for their services. And so I think what you're going to start to see now is as various American states start to loosen their lockdowns, and of course as Europe starts to come out of a lockdown, I think it's very unlikely we're going to get back to where we were at the beginning of this year.
The first effects of this disease was an interruption of supply chains, and I think that might remain with companies in that they might diversify their supply chains, and that was kind of happening anyway because China was becoming a more expensive place to manufacture things. As against that, supply chains have a strong sort of driving force for getting costs down and of being optimized, and they're pretty intolerant of inefficiencies, and so that will still sort of be pushing very strongly in the other direction.
I guess one thing I might add to that is to think about the financial system and about how that will, that's part of a supply chain too. How a company is able to access finance in order to start producing stuff. What you're seeing now, really across the world, is really unprecedented levels of uncertainty. And so I think what you could see is that financing new projects and getting people to commit to projects could actually become very difficult. And this is starting to show up in the data now, where If you look at surveys of managers, they're asked, what are your plans for investment and so on. They're much, much lower now than they were even in the absolute depths of the financial crisis of 2008-9. And bear in mind, back then, some people really thought the financial system was going to come to a complete stop. It's held up a mirror to the most vulnerable aspects of society. I mean, Singapore is a great example of that. It's a country that apparently had dealt with the outbreak extremely well, and then a few weeks down the line, there's these huge outbreaks in the migrant labour camp that keep the Singaporean economy going and are the kind of seedy underbelly of the Singaporean economy, and people there have very poor access to healthcare. And of course, there are still millions of people who are uninsured in the US, and there are worries that those people, and particularly if people lose their jobs, that people will be less willing to go forward for testing and so on. So I think what you could see, and this perhaps would be one of the biggest upsides of the whole pandemic, is that the idea of a universal access to healthcare that's free at the point of use could start to become common sense in all countries. So I think the pandemic will make states more powerful. If you look back at centuries of Western history, there's sort of two lessons that emerge about the power of states. One is that it tends to increase over time as a kind of background effect, and the second is that states tend to become a lot more powerful both during and immediately after periods of crisis. Normally in a recession, what happens is that the state, it doesn't like saying this, but it kind of accepts that in a recession, businesses will go bust and people will become unemployed. And it says that's okay because the idea is that you want to, reallocate people and capital and all that kind of stuff from areas that were failing to areas that are up and coming. And that's how it normally works. But what's happening this time is that states and governments and politicians are saying, basically, if we can, we want to avoid all bankruptcies and we want to make sure that nobody becomes unemployed. What that does is it opens the door to really significant government intervention in the economy going forward. So, let's imagine that in a few years we've sort of moved beyond this pandemic, but of course there will be another recession at some point down the line. I think if it's generally accepted that the government did a pretty good job during this crisis of protecting jobs and protecting firms, then people will say, well, hang on, if it worked last time, then why not do it again? So I think we could see quite radical changes in sort of expectations of what the state should do and what the state thinks it's legitimate for it to do.
You often hear people say that one thing, at least good thing that's come out of the pandemic is that it's been good for the climate. You can calculate, how many hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon dioxide haven't been put into the atmosphere because there have been fewer flights and so forth. And I suppose there is a sort of demonstration effect. That, people might, this is in a sense something that doesn't normally happen. But as against that, a poorer world, a world that has less inclination to invest, and a world that's worried about unemployment and life and death, is a world that I think is less inclined to invest in the transformation of the world to a sort of carbon-free economy. There's one big wrinkle on that, however, which is the oil industry. The price has collapsed. Countries in the Middle East, Russia, Venezuela, that depended upon oil as a very important, the main source of their foreign exchange earnings, are suddenly finding that they aren't getting enough money to do the things they want to do. Oil companies are beginning to see that perhaps the oil price might not recover for a very long time. That also is giving people a sort of inkling and a glimpse that there may be a future without oil, which is a very important component of the transition to away from a carbon-based economy.
I mean, it's going to become more distant, I suppose, in the sense that I think, if you're going to have a meeting with someone face to face, for the foreseeable future, that has to be a pretty worthwhile meeting. So I think the idea of going for a speculative coffee with someone will seem, at least for a while, kind of weird. You'll reserve your ventures out of the house for people that you sort of know you're going to have a productive time with. So I think that will potentially reduce the exchange of ideas and that kind of thing. And I think the same goes for travel, business travel and research travel and so on. If you look at what's happened, say, in the scientific community and in economics, most research papers now, most research projects involve a large team of people, and also a growing proportion of those projects involve people in more than one country. Normally that might be America or Canada, but you do get incredible diversity in cooperation. And I think that if meeting people and traveling becomes harder, you could see a really, really big hit to innovation and patenting and all that kind of stuff. Probably quite a lot. So we did a analysis a couple of weeks ago looking at which countries that were going to be most affected potentially by the turndown, and if you look at the very top of the ranking, so the countries most affected, they are tourism dependent economies. Greece comes unfortunately right at the top. And then Italy and Spain are pretty near the top as well, and Turkey also is very high up there. Particularly in Europe, tourism ministers are starting to talk to each other and say, how can we make this work? If Greece doesn't have a tourist season this summer, its economy is in really, really serious trouble. So what I expect you'll start to see is people thinking, pretty creatively about what they might do. So if you take the example of Israel, earlier this week they said that hotels could reopen, but you could only stay on the ground floor. I actually remain fairly optimistic about, say, the prospects that people will be able to travel and so on. I think it might become something that's open to fewer people. If the flight from, say, London to Spain is only allowed to be 2/3 full because of the required social distancing, then that means the ticket prices will have to go up, and so it will be available to fewer people. But my sense is that because this is such an important issue for some countries, that people will find a way of making this work, if at all possible. If you'd like to sign up to our newsletter on coronavirus for more updates, click the link opposite, and thank you for watching.